Hi, and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, premium thought at a wholesale price. I'm your host, Romans 918, and I'd like to welcome you. Today we have a treat. This is our third session in the Herman Bavinck Reading Group series, a series of 12 lectures focusing around the theology of Dutch Reformed theologian Herman Bavinck. And so tonight our session will be taking a look at the new university. Glad you could join us. All right, and welcome. It's great to have folks here. I'd like to welcome everybody, and we are going to get started. Let's get started here and open with a word of prayer and then a devotional reading from Colossians chapter 2. Feel free to follow along in your copy of God's Word, Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 6. But first, let's pray. Heavenly Father, please be with us tonight as we meet and talk about the good things of God, the clean and honorable things of God. Lord, let me speak careful and measured and honorable words, Lord. Let me speak justly and rightly, and Lord, help me to bring out the beauty that I see in the life of Herman Bavinck and in his theology that helps so many of us believers understand um, so many aspects of Christian life and interactions with believers and non-believers today. Thank you very much, Lord. Please be with each participant, and thank you for sending them here. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, the reading then is from Colossians chapter 2, verse 6. Let's enjoy the word of the Lord. So then, just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord, continue to live your lives in him, rooted and built up in him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world, rather than on Christ. For in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form, and in Christ you have been brought to fullness. He is the head over every power and authority. In him you were also circumcised, with a circumcision not performed by human hands. Your whole self, ruled by the flesh, was put off when you were circumcised by Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through your faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. When you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. This is the word of the Lord. Well, I guess we'll get started. So I entitled this session The New University, and it's kind of an homage to one of the essays from the book that you and I were reading together. the Cambridge History of Philosophy in the 19th century. So I'll go to the second slide here. And I just wanted to start off with some resources. So we've spent some time in chapter 1 with Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1, the Prolegomena. I'd like to ask the group of folks to start moving towards chapter 7 and 8, where we'll get into foundations of dogmatic theology and the Principia in the coming weeks. So that's not something that I expected anybody to have read for tonight. It's going to be something that we'll start to include more and more in the coming weeks, and we'll take a moment to sort of do a brief reprise and recap of chapter 1 too, so, 1 as well, so that we can sort of see if we can come together on that. Also with Bavinck's Reformed Ethics, Volume 1, we're at a great spot to take a look at chapter 3, the self against neighbor and God. And I think this chapter becomes so relevant when we start considering about some of the presuppositions and preconditions for Kantian and more generally Enlightenment thought. And that is this idea of this independent, autonomous self. And I think it's generally presupposed by Enlightenment thinkers that the autonomous individual is basically good in nature, and that these faculties have integrity, and that in thinking about thinking, as sort of Kant famously developed it, we actually have some insight into our thinking process so that we can make these pronouncements. And I think that Reformed theology can challenge that. And we can really sort of strike at the very fundamentals, the very foundation of Enlightenment reasoning. If in our own self-examination of self or thinking about thinking, if our own thinking is not as clear to us as we just sort of axiomatically assume it to be, then the whole endeavor really comes into question in a way that I think Bavinck brings out when he speaks about the essential nature of humankind. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's a video here as well from R.C. Sproul that's very helpful in sort of speaking about sort of an introductory framework and overview of epistemology, answering the question how and to what degree. And then finally, the last video there is, I'm going to say a lot of things that are sort of critical about the new university tradition or the modern university or the liberal arts and humanities university of contemporary times, modern and contemporary times. And I'm focusing much on the critical, but I don't want people to think that it's, that my critique is absolute in its scathing qualities, and that there's just not something good to say. So sort of studying the humanities, it's a marketing video from the graduate level at Oxford, talking about why it's good to study the humanities. And it's very broad in its principle and its product marketing-ish, but it's not, that in and of itself doesn't make it wrong. I think it's worth stating what the university at least was trying to do as an ideal. So, we may criticize the Enlightenment University for failing to meet that ideal, but if we don't at least acknowledge that there were such ideals, then I think we do an injustice with our criticism. And so there's an example there of something that I think is positive. And that's my idea throughout the whole session here, is to not think of the Enlightenment University as a complete evil, as a complete waste of time, something that Christians should consider completely anathema. Having said that, there'll be a lot here to sort of criticize. So we'll go on to the next slide. So sort of looking back on things, we've spent the previous 2 weeks, 2 sessions in chapter 1 of Reformed Dogmatics, volume 1, the Prolegomena, talking about the science of dogmatic theology. And so just the basic thing here to remember is that sort of contra Kant and contra most of the Enlightenment thinkers, the continental thinkers, I should say, because there was a sort of common sense school um, in England, in Britain, Scotland, that very much dissented against the German idealists, but dogmatism was typically portrayed as an evil, and Bavinck really, I think, convincingly shows that no one can be um, undogmatic or non-dogmatic or without dogma of some form, and that in fact dogma has an important role to play in human investigations of ontology and epistemology. And I think that's quite an important thing to note here. And then we looked also in the Reformed Ethics, Volume 1, the thesis, the Christian thesis about the nature of humankind. And this goes back to the thinking about thinking. We don't necessarily get an anthropological view of humankind as part of the Enlightenment thought up front. It just tends to be presupposed that people are basically good, that people are clear in their ability to look at themselves and evaluate uh, their own nature. And so Bavinck in his Reformed Ethics talks about the contrast, sort of the Reformed theology view of human nature, the fallen image of God. So, yes, we were created in righteousness and in the image of God, but that image has been corrupted in crucial ways by the fall into sin. And so the whole Enlightenment enterprise comes into question here because apparently, the Reformed thesis is that we are not um, enlightened optimism about the human animal uh, really seems overdone and untenably so. And so that's a really important thing. I think Bavinck gives us thesis to take to our argument with our Enlightenment friends. So next slide, we get into the next section, and we'll start talking about the main issues for tonight. So let's just go over some of the major themes. First of all, let's just reprise what we talked about previously with the example of pre-Enlightenment philosophy, and we talked specifically about Gottfried Leibniz and the God problem in philosophy and science. And so this is the idea that, we examined Leibniz's contingency argument, and we saw that um, pre-Enlightenment thinkers used God um, interchangeably along with scientific explanations um, as a means to explain and try to quantify philosophy and science. And we're going to find out that especially for the secular arm, but even in the non-secular, even in the Christian arm, there's a real hesitancy to want to sort of pin explanations on God per se. Now, I think Leibniz's contingency argument is sound. I think it's a great argument and it deserves um, a response. And just dismissing it because it uses God in it and that's somehow off limits is, I think, is an overdone secular idea. However, we do see during this time how the Kantian ideal of the partitioning of reality into noumenal and phenomenal categories helped to facilitate this removal of God from philosophy and science. So it was very clear that science was a part of the phenomenal world, making observations, applying reason, and coming to conclusions on the basis of observational data. That's clearly in the phenomenal realm. And God, his existence and his attributes were absolutely obvious from the very beginning that they were part of the noumenal realm. And so this is really the big facilitator. Kant's separation, Kant's putting God into the other box of the world. And then Kantian thinkers and Enlightenment thinkers in general, following Kant, just started making, de emphasizing the noumenal more and more, excluding it, emptying it of content, emptying it of appropriateness in the conversations. And so that led to a demotion of theology and Christian dogma, but dogma in general, as not something that Enlightenment thinkers would actually need to address or refute. They could simply say, well, that's inappropriate to bring up in our philosophy and science academic meetings. In addition to that, we have the rejection of an external authority. And most clearly, in the rejection of a biblical idea of a law giving God to whom people owed an allegiance, and had a duty to respond to. And so we'll look at that more tonight, categories of heteronomy versus autonomy. Next slide. Now, one thing I meant to mention last week, but just didn't have time to do, a very incisive and interesting Enlightenment era critique. And it's not particularly new to the Enlightenment. However, it did receive, it was greatly strengthened. And that was the role of criticizing hagiography. Now, hagiography is a style of writing that sort of embellishes, or let's say, what's the right word here? Makes a hero, or makes a takes the figure being written about and sort of elevates him, puts him on a pedestal, brings him into the realm of something that's beyond just sort of the brute facts of science. So, hagiography, what might be some great examples of hagiography? I grew up reading about the founding fathers of the United States of America, and I didn't read just brute facts about them, that Washington went here, that Washington went there, that Jefferson did this, that Madison did that. But intertwined into those narratives were these really strong elements of hero worship, and this idea that these men were acting in extremely commendable ways and in very, very high and to be lifted up ways. And so that's an example of hagiography. We can see it in other cultures, for example. Hagiography can definitely go overboard. In the ancient Near East, for example, during Old Testament times, it was very common for rulers of kingdoms in the Near East, what we today call the Middle East, to write about their deeds in this hagiographic style, which sort of minimized the opponent's participation and sort of maximized the ruler who was commissioning the writing of the document or of the stele. So, for example, you have these Egyptian obelisks and steles where the Egyptian pharaoh talks about how he completely destroyed his enemies. And then you sort of go to the enemy's documentation of the happenings of that same time, and you sort of get this different picture. And so hagiography got a really bad reputation for being partisan and sort of fast and loose with the truth. And so what we saw during the Enlightenment times is we saw this overplaying of hagiography on the part of religious, conservative, and traditional folks, and you have the Enlightenment folks criticizing that. Now, you can go both ways with this, though. You can reduce your heroes to people with feet of clay, and and indeed, you can you can actually remove some important moral content when you do that, and that's the danger here that the Enlightenment folks faced. Um, so for example, the American founding fathers that I grew up with, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, Thomas Jefferson, and his writing of the Declaration of Independence and participation in the founding of the country, James Madison writing the Constitution, other heroes, um, you know, almost all of them today have their narrative in the popular realm has been to bring them down and to really show them as being people with feet of clay. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson, his legacy is somewhat tarnished. He owned slaves, and not only did he own slaves, but there's an accusation that he even fathered children with one of them in an illegitimate fashion, and scandal and stigma and uh, that kind of thing, and it can go somewhat similarly for many of the other founding fathers, and so there's some contention here. Now, the interesting thing is when the enlightened nobles or these humanist secular folks criticize folks like religious figures, they make some incisive points, but they really do reduce heroes. However, when they consider their own uh, tribes people and their own leaders, the hagiography seems to sneak right back in. So, for example, I can't tell you um, sort of the same sort of hero worship that I grew up with that was reserved for Washington and Jefferson and Madison. I hear about humanists talk about for Hypatia, who was martyred in, I think, Alexandria in antiquity, was martyred and killed by a Christian mob for being pro science, pro learning, that sort of thing. And you read the articles about her, and it's absolute hagiography. Carl Sagan, when he speaks not only about people but even about the universe itself, um, starts to talk about beautiful truths of science or the elegance of science or all of these aesthetic terms, basically making a hagiography of the universe itself. Um, I grew up reading and enjoying Isaac Asimov, the humanist author, read many of his works, and he was just absolutely partisan in all the ways that we sort of have grown to love and expect from from secular folks who evaluate non-secular folks. So, in Asimov's eyes, he would talk about, he would build up the heroes who were humanists, and he would sort of, minimize the morality and the qualities of the non. Christopher Hitchens and the New Atheists, etc. So, apparently there's this partisan nature that's pretty damaging, and this has taken on a significant aspect today. So, um, I mention in here in this slide about how today's progressives aggressively demonize and demagogue their ideological and political opposition. Um, Let me be clear up front that it can go both ways. It's not simply a partisan thing that only progressives on the left do. However, in my sort of day-to-day living situation, I'm very confronted with it sort of all the time. I have and maintain a subscription to the New York Times, um, and it's I'm aghast at how that publication, as well as so many other publications, seem to be so blatantly about trying to sway my beliefs, even more than informing me about issues of the day. And it seems so obvious as to be scandalous. And so, we see this sort of also in the way that science has been weaponized and this idea of consensus, appealing to consensus. So, a very interesting development along those lines. We'll go to the next slide here. Now, related to this, let's talk a little bit more about the idea of heteronomy and autonomy. Now, these are terms, these are Enlightenment terms, and not particularly Christian terms, but these are these come down to ideas that started with Kant. And this presupposed idea that the human will must be free to be what it will be, unrestrained and independent and autonomous from external compulsion and authority. And so people desire to be free, the Kantian thought would articulate here. People desire to be free from the bridle of external authority, much in the same manner as horses might desire to be free from the bit and the bridle and the rider. And so we have to look at this and compare, how does this fit in terms of traditional categories of morality? And so we have this idea, it just comes as a presupposition that we ought to reject external categories of morality and duty to a divine lawgiver, as it was sort of traditionally or classically articulated in the Christian orthodoxy of Kant's day. So, in other words, for example, why should the Ten Commandments be binding on me? Someone from the Kantian camp might argue. I need to be free to be what I ought to be, what I am to be, and what my independent being should be. And now that's asserted, and strongly so, but why should that be? In other words, why is it so pejorative or negative to associate something bad with external authority? I think that's an open question that Enlightenment thinkers have to answer and address. And even in spite of this, even trying to talk about autonomy, Kant still tried to ground morality in these objective categories of duty. And so you and I remember reading and sort of puzzling about this together. We were reading about how Kant would talk about this right of people to be free, and yet at the same time want to insist that we had obligations of duty. And it's quite a puzzler. And Enlightenment successors to Kant and Hegel sort of fairly quickly threw off these Kantian categories. Anything else that comes to your mind about this, or what do you think? Did we kind of get close here?
Yeah, I think so. It was really interesting to read through Kant and this idea that there could be duties even in autonomy. And I think you're right that he did try to ground morality in duty, and a lot of his critics later on, didn't appreciate that. I think I understand, that he saw duty perhaps differently than an Orthodox Christian would. An Orthodox Christian would see duty in a way, related to one's duty to God, perhaps to the law, and obviously there are different ways that different Christians talk about that. And I think in Kant, what he tried to sort of make the argument, it seemed to me that there's some sort of duty to oneself, to one's true self. And then it seemed like there were some others that then sort of moved that humanity, and the one's duty really became to the whole of humanity, but oneself as they fit in that, and others just wanted to get rid of it. But it was really sort of interesting to watch him sort of twist and turn to try to make.
Yeah, well said. Twist and turn is really a fair characterization there. Okay, and then the last interesting thing, this tension that you pointed out so well about wanting to ground morality in objective categories of duty, and yet wanting this sort of absolute freedom of independent, autonomous being at the individual level. It really went the way you were talking about, where, Kant and Hegel really tried to maintain this and really tried to resolve these tensions, even if they weren't successful ultimately in our own evaluation. I can still appreciate that both of them really did seem to be sincere about trying to resolve it. But you go a generation or two out from Kant and Hegel, you go into following authors, and you get, by the time you get to Marx and Nietzsche, this is so far long gone as to be sort of laughable. And so there was a very famous quote by a contemporary of Bavinck: "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." And I'm going to ask if anybody on here knows who said that. And it's a obscure reference for us today, so it's not a big thing if you don't know who said this. But does anybody know who made that statement? Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Sounds like an antinomian.
Well, it's very close. It's actually Aleister Crowley who made that statement, and Crowley was a Satanist, contemporary of Bavinck's. And his context was, we don't need this divine lawgiver. We don't need the 10 commandments when we have our own inner light. And as much as Kant and Hegel really tried to legitimately resolve the tension in there, I think as believers we have to really question how that developed. And by the time you get to Nietzsche and Marx and Crowley, it's pretty clear that the endeavor really spiraled out of control. Okay, we'll go into the next slide here. So after sort of that first and second generation, especially related, since we're talking about the new university, especially as the new model of the Enlightenment University that we'll talk about in the coming slides, especially as that took off, we see that there was sort of this wholesale rejection of Christian fundamentals and ideas, with something else moving into the vacuum. And qualifying that something else is going to be a big part of these lectures. So it's not just that one thing replaced Christianity, but it really, I think, as Ken and I sort of have talked privately about this in reading about this time period, there really almost is a, anything but God goes in this sort of new modern Enlightenment approach. Anything but sort of the classical categories might even be better. And when pressed about, the utility of such things, attack sort of the classical view by defaulting to a skeptical, corrosive secular phenomenology. And if you've ever had anybody, a non-believer, ask you for evidence, or maybe put it in the more aggressive way, if there was only even one shred of evidence, you sort of see the blind spot that I think is here, because I think Christians have provided evidence. And so it's not a case of a lack of evidence, but a case of a willful rejection of the evidence and claims. Now, here's the interesting point, though. This rejection of classical categories was not just a part of the secular arm of the Enlightened, but it also included Christian thinkers as well. So you'll see that Bavinck opposes, during his lifetime, the liberalism of those who inherited from Friedrich Schleiermacher's Protestant liberal ideas. So in this case, Julius Kaftan, Ritschl, the Tübingen school, sort of all developed and moved forward from Schleiermacher's concept of the innate religious feeling as being the most important location for religious truth, an intuition that was stronger and to be followed even over the creeds and confessions and even scriptures. So in this sense, Protestant liberalism was the big victor um, in terms of market share, mind share, and participation in this new university enterprise. It largely embraced the new Enlightenment language, which in itself is not, I don't think in and of itself that's a bad thing. But in addition to that, you see in the theology of Protestant liberals, you see the emptying of the noumenal supernaturalism of traditional orthodoxy in favor of science and progress and socio-political improvement. And supernaturalism really portrayed as superstitionism. We'll go to the next slide here. That's really where things developed. So Protestant liberalism emerged, Schleiermacher, the turn to the intuitive and the subjective feeling. Now, these are not necessarily direct quotes, but if you've heard things like this, you sort of understand maybe the liberal ethos or zeitgeist. And so if you hear people say things like, well, I trust my gut in these matters about what God approves and what God doesn't approve, or if you've ever heard somebody say, to thine own self be true. It sounds so noble, it sounds so high and so lofty. Other people might say things like, since God gave us a brain, we should use it. And of course, what they mean by that is that the brain supplants and deprecates the old classical categories of appeal. So no 10 commandments, no biblical authority, just use your brain. You'll know what to do about what's right. Sometimes we see it stated in things like, I have no creed but Christ, someone might say. And so in this landscape, you have people evaluating the Bible and God by external subjectivist standards for good and evil. In other words, you have people asking the leading question, how do you feel about this issue, as if it might matter? And so this, going down to the last point, this really does put the progressive as a jurist, a legal jurist, sitting in the judgment seat and clinically analyzing God in some quote unquote scientific fashion. And what we see is the analysis concludes all so often that God is a moral monster, especially the God of the Old Testament. And so under this rubric, people are basically good, and it becomes very hard to understand the need of the cross. Why did Christ need to die? It's much less and less about saving wicked sinners from sins, for after all, in this liberal ethos, we're not necessarily even all that bad. And it's much more about him being a good man or a good example or providing this good example. And so this is where Bavinck and sort of the Reformed orthodoxy, the anthropological aspects of it, come into such play. This is striking. See, I think we really do find a naivete among Enlightenment thinkers that people are basically good. I can tell you about a personal situation where I was talking with a dear friend who's not a believer, and we were talking about the gospel. And my dear friend said to me, kind of, this was kind of the end of the discussion, and they took my hand and looked me in the eye and said, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't believe I need to be born again because I wasn't born wrong the first time. I'm basically good. I'm not a sinner that needs saving. And so this, when she said this, it was just sort of right out of the buoyant optimism of Enlightenment secular thinking. Next slide here. Now, an interesting aspect of this was what we find is at the very same time that the secular arm and the Protestant liberal arm criticized and rejected traditional concepts and sources, at the very same time, they sort of acknowledged the value in them and decided, well, we need to replace those traditional categories with things of our own. And one of the great ways that they wanted to do that was, the Bible needs to be replaced. It's a book that was helpful for people in the Bronze Age, but we've progressed so far since then. And so we need something better as a guiding document. But what should that be? And so, in fact, the modern encyclopedia was one proposal. Now, it's not that encyclopedias are in their nature secular, or that only secular people ever proposed coming up with these compendiums of knowledge. But this was definitely a place where many secularists wanted to build around and come up with their own canonical writings and their own writings that they could refer to a moral authority with. And so this image that's on this slide is actually an image from the Encyclopedia of Denis Diderot. And Diderot was an atheist, maybe around the time of Newton or Leibniz, so slightly pre-Enlightenment, but he sort of jump-started this idea of coming up with the encyclopedia as something that was explicitly anti-religious and explicitly sort of about replacing the Bible with something better. And so you'll see this all throughout the Enlightenment. You'll see where there were unopposable positives that religion and belief in God and faith in Christian orthodoxy brought to society, we see the secularists and the liberals replacing those things with their own options that they believe would be just as workable. Now, here's an interesting thing. I grew up with encyclopedias. I think they have a virtue that is not merely secular. So even though the motives of many people who pushed encyclopedias in the culture were contra-Christian, I don't think that necessarily makes encyclopedias sinful or evil or something for Christians to avoid or not take part in. But you're going to see over and over again when there is something that the Christian world does in a positive fashion, the secular or liberal aspects of that will seek to replace it. And so the encyclopedia is just one of the best examples there. So next slide. And so in the same vein, sort of the traditional scholastic university. And so these are the kind of universities that tended to be run by the Roman Catholic Church in the south of Europe, as well as the kind of universities that were run by the princes in the north, and were largely based around the Protestant scholastic ideas. And so those older schools, that older school model was out, and this new idea about education, it was put in its place, and philosophy replaces the old, stodgy, outdated classicism of Aristotle and the Bible, the winds of free thought, and this really sort of comes together in a very notable way in the University at Jena in Thuringia in Germany, starting around 1775, so about the time of the American Revolutionary War. And this came into vogue. It just really came popular right at the same time as Kant and his philosophy came onto the scene, and successive Enlightenment thinkers in the same vein. So in 1786, for example, we have Karl Reinhold publishing and advocating, and the university sort of taking and running with these letters on Kantian philosophy. Next slide. And so I'm going to read a quote from a work about this, and it's going to really capture sort of some of the ethos and zeitgeist associated with this new model of the university. And the quote goes like this: "The appeal of philosophy to these young people was intense. For the generation born around 1770, there was a growing sentiment that life in Europe was on the verge of fundamental change. Indeed, that life simply had to change. That generation came to see themselves as leading unprecedented lives. unable to take their bearings from what their parents and grandparents had done. And they took to Kant's doctrines of moral autonomy and non-rule bound aesthetic judgment as guides to what shape this new form of self-directed life would take. The Jena model of the university, with Kantian philosophy at its center and a stress on autonomy and self-criticism that accompanied it, was a natural attraction for these youth. And what we have here, what we have here is the end run around the traditional gatekeepers of parents and the state. So these new university professors appealed directly to the young people of the time. And I watched a lecture on Kantian philosophy from Robert Paul Wolff, the atheist, and he talked about how Kant had to lecture. Kant and contemporaries of his day had to lecture and sort of charge admission the way we charge admission for concerts or events today. And so these professors had to appeal to the young people enough, at least, to get their money. University pay was not typically high, and professors usually supplanted or supplemented, I should say, their salary by the fees that students would pay them directly. And so you had to be popular, you had to reach, and you had to appeal to the youth of the time. And so here we see that sort of end run around parents and grandparents, sort of the traditional family nucleus. And you have this new Kantian philosophy being inserted there. And what a model for what has happened in the West since then. You know, at almost every stage, new ideas are introduced one generation at a time to a new generation, and it's marketed towards them, and it's marketed to appeal to them, and not to go through the traditional classic gatekeepers. Next slide. And then you start to see some exclusivity about the whole thing. So Schiller, who was one of the founders of this university in Jena, said only the philosophical mind belongs in a university. In other words, if you're sort of not hip enough to get this philosophical spirit, well, then you don't even belong here. And so with that approach, this university at Jena changed the ideal of education, changed sort of the idea of what it meant to be a professor, as well as changing sort of the centrality of criticism. Teaching and research during this time were largely fused together. And interestingly enough, the very winds of change that the university at Jena advocated for largely ended up being a part of its own destruction, and not directly. So the Napoleonic Wars sort of redrew Germany and France. And in the aftermath of them, the new political map led to new universities being founded on the Jena model, and the older ones, the scholastic ones, being replaced and dying out as they went out of favor. And so Jena was actually sort of a casualty of its own, of the own era that it sort of brought into being. However, these newer universities were largely in this same liberal arts and humanities Enlightenment mold. Next slide. So after hearing all of this, it sounds horrible. How can Christians collaborate when non-believers are so openly hostile to Christian values in these institutions? And so we've got the examples of the Encyclopedia. You know, how can we participate even though many aim for the Encyclopedia to supplant the Bible? Other contemporary examples that affect us to this day. How can we work with people who insist on gender neutral language? How can we work and cooperate and collaborate with people who want to change the traditional dating conventions, you know, from BC to BCE, and from AD, Anno Domini, to CE, or Common Era? And, you know, you look at these conventional changes and they really seem to be motivated not by any other external factor than to simply reject the traditional categories. And then, of course, you've got the same sort of thing. How can I be a scientist or work with scientists who are so opposed to theistic narratives, are so involved with secular or anti-theistic narratives? In other words, how can I work in a science where evolution dominates, as well as less with the sort of harder sciences, but in the softer sciences and the humanities? How can I work with societies that discourage and disparage Christian narratives and even participation? So, for example, academia today, the mainstream media, Hollywood. I haven't seen everything Hollywood has done in my lifetime, but I'm really hard pressed to find more than maybe 5 or 6 portrayals over the space of the last 30 years or so. Maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 portrayals of Christians positively outside of sort of the Christian area of things. So, we'll see folks in academia speak of the virtues of this culture and native peoples here and indigenous peoples that there. But when it comes to sort of the traditional Christian culture of the West, it's just about universally condemned as imperialistic, patriarchal, and colonialist. Same thing with the mainstream media. No matter what it is, if it's an indigenous people's issue, if it's if it's another culture outside of the Western civilization, it deserves to be treated with respect and reverence for its ideas. But the similar thing doesn't seem to follow through for Christian values. And like I said, with Hollywood and the portrayals of Christians, I would say probably maybe 20 to 1 Christians are portrayed in Hollywood and sort of movies and popular cultural story narratives as being foolish or antiquated or not with the times or on the wrong side of history. Like I said, only maybe 3 or 4 times or 5 times outside of the Christian circles do we ever see Christians portrayed virtuously. And how can we do that? So how can we live and work with such societies? Next slide here. And I think one of the great things that I wanted to bring up with this reading group is that Herman Bavinck is himself a great example of how to do that. So Bavinck was brought up in a solid Christian background, and I would say that is the prerequisite. That's a fundamental. You have to have a solid Christian background before you go into the world. I believe that it's much more difficult, if not relatively speaking, almost impossible to be a solid Christian without such a background, without such a grounding. So, there's this famous saying, how can you send your child off to school with the Romans and then be surprised when they come back saying Hail Caesar? And Bavinck wasn't like that. He was brought up in a solid Christian background. But even though that was the case, he still trained in the best institutions available, and he chose to study at a quote unquote liberal university in this new Jena style. And so I think that we as believers understanding all this can trust that God is still in control and God is still sovereign, and he will lead the individual believer into spirit and truth, even in these harsh environments or unappealing environments. And I think we should also recognize that not all non-believers are aggressive anti-theists. Or let me see if I can say it in the direct fashion. Many non-believers are not anti-Christian. And I think because of that, there's room for us in that marketplace of ideas. So we should also recognize as believers that not everything about modern universities are bad, simply because of their stated opposition to orthodoxy. And finally, I think we can trust that God has placed you and I. When we're placed in these situations, I think we're placed where he wants us to be. I think about biblical figures like Daniel working in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. Surely, surely a hostile environment. And yet God found a way to work with Daniel Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, and to bring great good to those situations. And I think we can work with the new university and do that here as well. Next slide. However, having said that, here's where we get critical. Here's where I get critical about the future of the Enlightenment model of the university. And I know you're probably saying, wait a minute, that wasn't critical what you just said before. But I think I think this is where, some of the things we're seeing in our culture today really call into question, bring some serious doubt about the future of the Enlightenment university. Now, I would say this is my own characterization. The quote unquote hard sciences have generally been fruitful, but it's not clear that this promotion of philosophy and demotion of theology has has done has been an improvement, has been a net improvement. And in particular, it really is starting to look like the soft sciences are simply petri dishes for the aggressive fomenting of revolution. And we see this, for example, in the weaponization of science and criticism. So I'll share a story, and I say this, for example, who is reading literature for literature's sake? The ugliness in today's culture that represents the academic world, this intersectionality, this critical race theory, this neo Marxism, this postmodernism was just a small a small thing 30 years ago when I was in the university. So there really was a strong feeling that the humanities had managed to some degree to sort of work with classical education and to make some measure of peace with it. However, 30 years ago when I was in the university, I found that the English department at the university I was at was completely infested and corrupted with these evil, God-hating, anti-theistic, revolutionary Marxist fomenters. And it was just in the English department at that time, and it was quite subdued to where it is now. And I remember 30 years ago thinking to myself, what's going to stop this? What's going to stop this horrible foment of revolution from taking over the university, and then from the university taking over the culture? And now it's 30 years later, and our culture has to really either tame this beast or be slain by it. Next slide, please. And so we've seen that in some very measured ways here, the humanities seem much more about training future elites in the art of narrative building and influencing and control. And by influencing, I very politely mean becoming ungovernable if one's tribe isn't the one in power. We saw that in the last election. And again, I'm not trying to make this about one party over another, but there were explicit statements: resist, become ungovernable, when one side won over the other in the last presidential election. And I think this is wholly, I think this is wholly a result of the poison of the Enlightenment University. Now, on the positive side, changes in technology have spread the fruits of the encyclopedic sciences. So this idea of encyclopedia, even if it was meant to supplant the Bible in some sense, has still borne another kind of fruit. And now in today's date, resources that sort of used to be centrally located and relatively rare in university libraries are now significantly more accessible. So I have maybe about 150 to 200 books in my own personal library here in my study. And I have twice as many as that on my laptop. So, that's 500, 600 volumes. I could, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I could not have had that kind of library and access to that kind of information. And now I have it right here, and it's so convenient, and it's awesome, and it's wonderful. Now we see a focus in the objects of wealth, and I didn't quite word this well, so let me try to explain, and you all can throw things at me because I deserve it. But the focus has somewhat changed from focusing on objects like commodities and resources and their control as being what wealth is about, to this idea of intellectual property as being objects worthy of being controlled. So, if you remember, for many years, it was a crime to sing happy birthday in sort of the common style, because that was violating somebody's intellectual property. And you see more and more with with songs, with performances, with works of art, with cartoons, with every sort of entertainment, diversion, art, whatever it is. You see intellectual property and its control being much more of the focus of where wealth is in the societies today. And so ideas have and are the objects of value. And this includes the selling of narratives and education in much the way that monopolies and big companies of a previous century used to sell petroleum, or used to sell shipping services, the railroads, for example. These great monopolies that spawned Standard Oil, or the railroads, or any of those great, the electric companies, for example, these great monopolies of 100 years ago or so. Now you see the shift being from those sort of objects of last century to narratives and education and access to information being used as the new standard and control. Next slide. So let's take a look at this. This image on this slide is right out of today's Washington Times. University of Alabama professor instructs rioters on how to tear down monuments. So, in some sense, the milk of the Enlightenment University has soured. In some sense, it's not training productive and edifying thought leaders of tomorrow so much as training aggressive revolutionaries of radical change. And, the fear here is that this is a continuation of the socialist French and communist Russian and Chinese revolutions of 100 years ago and 200 years ago, respectively. And this sort of sense of the university as this prototypical, unfettered, autonomous living arrangement, where when you're at university, you're tenured, or you're a student and you don't have the direct responsibilities of society, or you're a tenured professor and you theoretically don't have the same responsibilities that of being productive that people who regularly participate in a more regular way in society do, and endlessly advocating for more rights. So, in other words, going to university, when I was growing up and in my grandparents' generation, it was a luxury to be educated, and it was unthinkable that university was about finding my own identity or finding oneself. But today, there really is an expectation in the part of students that it's a venue for them to be sexually and politically liberated. That is a real change in expectation over previous generations. Now, a thing to note is that those in the university setting, in this incubatory bubble, then seem to want to claim the major problems with society are bound up with those who are undeserved and entitled, and sort of these partakers in privilege. And it really seems like academia is describing itself. Now, what is it to go around your neighborhood reacting against the evil 1%? When you in academia, as a student at these universities, are yourself one of these incubated sort of top 1% elites of the coming decades. So I saw a lecture where I think it was Jordan Peterson. It might have been somebody else, but was giving a lecture to his students, saying, what does it mean to complain about the evil 1%? You're in this lecture hall learning to be the 1% and learning to be in the roles that correspond with being the elite. And, what does it mean to riot and protest and loot as a justified tool of revolution? So a very interesting development sort of in the newer generation today is this idea of punch a Nazi. Rather than sort of discuss, talk things out, have interfaith dialogues, listen to each other, there really is a strong sense, and it's to the degree that it can be on both sides, it's not a productive thing. But we really see sort of this sense that one part of America looks at another part of America and says, I don't need to talk with you. I'm just going to punch you. You're a Nazi. And with all of the inherent difficulties associated with that. And so finally, I keep coming to, when I think about the modern Enlightenment university and what it's come to, I see sort of reminders of this biblical story of David and Absalom, and this idea that Absalom was a child of privilege. He had every royal prerogative in the land of his father, the king, David. And yet, the only thing Absalom wanted was the only thing David couldn't give him, which was his own throne. And so Absalom could not, for whatever reason, be satisfied with that and became rebellious and usurping his own father's throne. So there's this idea of biting the hand that feeds it. And I think that's the real struggle facing today's Enlightenment humanities university. Now, this is not a blanket condemnation. This is not saying that everything has to go this way. This is sort of just a reflection on some important trends. Can things change? Can things move forward? Maybe. I just think that if things do not move forward, it does seem to me like a major change will happen and take place in the future. And so that's the thoughts there. We'll open it up to questions and answers. Thank you for being so patient here.
This may seem it's going in some different directions, but just the Enlightenment and the change back in Bavinck's time to, I think about what Francis Schaeffer talked about, this growing, secular humanism happening. He talked about a line, this idea of modernism, modernity, and then postmodernism. N was the measure, there is no measure. How do you see either one of those flowing out of some of the Enlightenment thinking that we're seeing? Do both of them have the same, both modernism and postmodernism have the same genealogy into the Enlightenment, or is there a different thread?
That's a great question.
No, it's off topic too, but yeah.
No, it's that it does fit here, and it's worth asking. So I would say this. Here's my own take: modernism and postmodernism are family. So I would say that modernism is the father, and postmodernism is the son. So one of the big revelations in modernism was this idea that knowledge, at least, if not truth itself, was perspectival, meaning relativistic, meaning it depends upon the nature of the perceiving subject. And then from that foundation, that phenomenological foundation, the postmodernists came in with these sort of assumptions that there is no such thing as a canonical truth. There's your truth, there's my truth, there might be this group of people's truth for now, but this sort of absolute relativism, if such a thing can be maintained, this situational aspect of it. And so in that sense, I feel like postmodernism is just sort of the son of modernism. Does that answer? Was that going in the direction you were thinking?
Well, I wasn't sure what you're going to say. I mean, it seems like postmodernism, as I was trying to summarize, maybe oversimplistically, that there is no measure. Like you said, complete. Every decision stands alone on itself. That's the only absolute. That there is no absolute. That seems like it is turned on the father then, very, very heavily, because it fights against modern view of man is the measure. God is no longer the measure. His law is no longer the measure. In modernism, it's man is, and then there is no measure. we've taken another step. And
Yeah, I
it,
think that's fair. Go ahead.
it's in some ways it is a child, in some ways it's a complete enemy of it. It seems like postmodernism has battles modernism very effectively.
Yeah,
Kind of
it
like it.
has. Think about this, Craig. When I'm not sure how old you are. I only say it to say that in my own lifetime, when I was young, I worshiped and I fellowshipped with many liberals, with many moderns. And even though they were modern and even though they were liberal, I still had a sense that there was, to some degree, a strong belief in the Christian message. Now, how can that be when so many of the foundations were removed? I think you can still have a strong belief even if your foundations, your doctrinal explanations and foundations aren't quite right or don't quite line up or add up. I really have this sense that liberals thought highly of Christianity, even as they sort of worked to undermine it in their own doctrinal advances. And yet, in the last 15 to 20 years, I would say that's changed to where, this postmodern spirit of loathing has replaced it. And I do not feel comfortable. I don't think I could generally worship with postmoderns, and I don't think they would feel comfortable worshiping with me. I think worship might even be anathema or foreign to them on principle.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania,
Okay.
and
Because
go ahead.
uh, I'm just thinking I brought Francis Schaeffer in because he talked about I don't remember if he said we're 40 years behind Europe in terms of moving to modernism to postmodernism, or moving above and below the line, that concept of there's a change. I grew up in New England, and what I can say is many years ago when I was a kid, I had a pastor who said, "We don't worship Jesus Christ here." And my atheist father would go to church too, and he would say, "That guy's a phony." So I think there's a difference. When you look out west, you look in the Northeast, particularly New England, I think that I want to say they're 20 to 30 or 40 years ahead, but they're farther ahead in terms of that, moving to that mindset. What you're seeing now, Western Pennsylvania, Midwest, those type of items were quite a bit different than, I would say, New England, some of the Western states were. When I moved to the South, I found it quite different. That's just really some observations. It seems like we're up to US, but there's also a pretty big difference between regions of the US. I don't know. That's just a thought. You can comment or
Yeah, yeah, I think it's fair. Did you mention? Was it you who said last time that maybe you grew up with it? Was it Presbyterian? Was it PCUSA or was it another?
I'm Presbyterian now, the
Okay,
PCA. I grew up in a Methodist church, college. I was in the New York district.
gotcha. Well, the reason I ask is I was as a teenager, I attended a Presbyterian church in the PCUSA, and as you know, being in the PCA, you know what has happened in the PCUSA in the last 25 30 years, and like you say, in some regions even earlier than that. I think what you're saying is absolutely true. Where I grew up, the way it was characterized to me in that PCUSA church was, you know, we've moved on to something better now that the Westminster Confession of Faith was it's kind of quaint, it's kind of nice in a nostalgic sense. It's what we used to believe. We don't believe that now. We're a little bit more enlightened. We're a little bit more hip. We're just a little, we've moved forward. We've progressed. Those are the kinds of things that were communicated to me in that setting. And so many of those people sang the old hymns, for example. They loved singing the old hymns, even as they despised the underlying doctrines more and more. And so there was this underlying tension and dissonance between them. But at least as a child, I felt, as a young man, I could worship with them. And like you said, I think it's largely regional. But I think if I went there today to that same PCUSA church, I think it would be quite awkward.
I wanted to jump in. I don't know a lot about postmodernism other than sort of basics. I wonder, has either of you read Jamie Smith? No, he's got a book called Who's Afraid of Postmodernism? And he sort of works with a number of philosophers of postmodernism and trying to sort of in the same way that we've worked to grab what's good and useful out of Kant and out of later philosophers. He tries to do the same out of postmodernism. At least one of the reviews that I've seen of the book says that we really sort of following sort of the model of Francis Schaeffer in looking at postmodernism, looking at it as a philosophy and sort of demythologizing it. Basically saying that we don't fully understand it and we need to understand it a little better. I haven't got any further than reading reviews. I haven't bought the book yet either. I wondered if either of you is.
I haven't read that book.
Yeah, I haven't either, but I think the thesis is sound. Part of my own reason for reading about the Enlightenment with you was not just to learn about the Enlightenment for its own sake, although I absolutely wanted to do that. But I think it was also, I think if you don't swim in the Enlightenment waters, then the postmodernistic waters are just going to be, rapids that are just going to be, unnavigable, and the currents will pull you in so many directions, and until you just can't make heads or tails of it. What I find is so many of the postmoderns will still acknowledge much in the modern era. They'll still talk and use sort of the Kantian terminologies and language, Hegelian, Marx, Nietzsche, will still kind of work within the frameworks of those. And so if you have a facility, if you have an ability to use that terminology and speak in those spaces, I think those are almost a precondition for Christians to interact well with postmodernists themselves. I'll give you an example of someone who does this. So Jordan Peterson is a great example of someone who is not a postmodernist and is opposed to postmodernism very vehemently, and yet he actually gets invited to panel discussions with postmodernists. And of course, he's there as a hostile witness or a hostile opponent, and sort of, they're much more about debate and disputation. But because he speaks with those classic liberal categories, there's still an ability to communicate. And I feel that that's been lost in the Reformed world. So I don't feel that there's anybody in the vein of a Francis Schaeffer or a Herman Bavinck today who is speaking confessionally in those circles. And I don't mean that as an accusation. I think there's a real big divide, and I think the postmodernists as well as the modernists have tried to exclude the Reformed from all of their reindeer games, to use a Rudolph analogy, exclude from their parties and their catered seminars and lunches and such. But that was my hope here, is that to get into the door of postmodernism, you sort of have to walk through the corridor of the modern and the liberal. So that was part of my hope in this study.
I do think Jamie Smith, he's probably not at the level where everyone in secular academia is paying attention to him, but I think he's headed in the right direction in that regard. He does seem to be where he's had contact. He seems to be generally appreciated. I think for the most part, where I've still seen him is more in various kinds of Christian circles. And I think he is trying to move beyond that, sort of be I think his goal might be to be the next one of Calvin University's Fab Four or whatever, the next generation.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting sticking points, because I have an interest in sort of interacting and engaging with postmoderns. One of the interesting sticking points is, just as just as my Calvinist brothers and sisters on social media almost always insist upon using scholastic language, classic pre-Enlightenment categories of talking about things, and it's really difficult to find a Calvinist who can sort of step out of that. And because of that, those Calvinists really aren't going to get invited to any postmodernist parties soon. I've got a real concern that I'll be able to penetrate that society in an edifying way either, because the postmodernists seem to be similarly partisan and tribalistic with their vocabulary and terminology. So just like the Calvinists on social media require that you sort of think and speak in that scholastic language, the postmodernists really require you to affirm a basic postmodern confession of faith. You know, you have to acknowledge your privilege. You have to start by acknowledging the categories of critical race theory, acknowledging these neo-Marxist categories of power and duty and responsibility. And if you don't do that, you're not even, the door's not even open to the outer courts, let alone the inner courts. So even though I want to dialogue with folks, it's to me a really open question whether that will happen. I'm guessing that perhaps the niche might be like Craig said, instead, dialoguing with Christians about postmodernists instead of actually dialoguing with the postmodernists themselves. But one can pray and one can hope.
I do think that there's a sense in which there is a divide still in academia. I realize it's more present in certain um, areas than others between modernism and postmodernism. And I think that is also an opportunity for Christian thinkers to, on various issues where we may agree with modernists and oppose postmodernists, or vice versa, to sort of jump in to those discussions. I had somebody in my church convinced that the effect of postmodernism, while he wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of postmodernism, he believes that the effect of postmodernism is actually going to be beneficial to Christians in the long run, because your average, pew sitter slash, undergrad student, who's just looking to get through undergrad and get a nice job, isn't going to be particularly cognizant of all the specific details, and therefore, by sort of being drawn in by sort of just the general idea of you can't judge this based on that, because everything's got to be considered sort of on its own, that you may actually lose, those people may actually lose the ability to make some of the arguments that have previously been made against Christianity. I don't know if he's correct about that or not. He specifically goes there because of his experience with his daughters. I think one of them did go all the way through high school and college in Christian schools, but his other daughters ended up going to a public high school, Christian grade school. And over a period of time, from the first one to the fourth one who went through public schools, he notices even just a difference in how your typical high school senior thinks about things. And he thinks it's been definitely affected by postmodernism, but is also, more open to just sort of whatever. Oh, Wiccanism is good, Christianity is good, Buddhism is good, whatever. As opposed to a somewhat more training in sort of just, a lot of times a very evidentialist, positivist way of thinking. You can't prove that God exists, and therefore I'm not going to believe in him. I don't know. We can only hope.
Well, you mentioned something really interesting, because I had not heard this until recently. I heard somebody else say roughly the same thing. I'm seeing some articles and some sort of opinion pieces from folks in the sort of postmodernist section of things that's rejecting the new atheists, rejecting the new atheism as being just another form of fundamentalism. And so,
Mhm.
that really is, I see that, and that's really a new thing. I had not heard of this maybe except prior to the last month or two. So maybe there is something to that.
Well, I mean, it is the cannibalism of sorts where the postmodern is attacking the modernist. Modernism is not necessarily able to handle the onslaught of postmodernism. Postmodernism's been here for quite some decades now. But it's, that idea that there is no measure is one step farther from, God's law is the standard, God is the measure, to man is the measure, to there is no measure. And it's like each one gets a little bit harder. There is no measure is more consistent, and man is the measure. But it's hollow, and so it leaves a hole. We know it leaves a hole. It doesn't work. It's not consistent. I don't know what I tell my father. He's an atheist. He's wants to be a postmodernist. He's caught between post-modernity and modernity. Neither of those is very satisfying.
That's very insightful. I love how you've put that progression. I love how you've described it as, modernism being man is the measure, and then postmodernism meaning, there is no measure to be had. And
I don't remember who said that, if it was Myers or someone else who had listed that as a nice hook to hang off some of the other thoughts about the distinctive philosophy. But I didn't come up with that.
well, it's an
If it,
interesting, yeah, it's interesting because there's a tension here. The very same folks who will tell you that there is no measure will nevertheless advocate in political and scientific circles for particular narratives as if there were a measure. So if there is no measure, why is climate change something to be fought? If there is no measure, why have any outrage at racism or bigotry or homophobia? So, it's there really is an unresolved tension here in the fact that doctrinally speaking, there's no measure, and yet there's absolutely measures when it comes to this sort of applications of it in daily life. Great. Yeah. Anything else that anybody can think of for tonight?
good. Thanks. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you so much. Blessings to you, and
See you next week.
bye. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. This is Romans 9:1-8.